Good morning and welcome to the Middle East Program's panel discussion on the war in Yemen and the implications for regional security as well as U.S. national security interests in the region. I'm Marissa Khurma, the director of the Middle East Program. The conflict in Yemen reached new levels 2 weeks ago, 2 weeks into the new year, when Yemeni Houthis, a militant group backed by Iran, launched attacks with drones and missiles against the United Arab Emirates. A reminder of how easily this war can escalate tensions across the region. And since then, the Saudi-led military coalition, of which the United Arab Emirates is a member, has intensified its strikes against Houthi strongholds as well as training camps. This escalation continues to unfold in one of the poorest countries in the region that continues to suffer one of the worst humanitarian crises to date, as the civil war ravages Yemen's population and infrastructure. To date, the UN estimates that almost 400,000 people were killed either directly or indirectly due to hunger or disease. To discuss the situation in Yemen, the US policy towards Yemen, and the regional security implications is truly a stellar panel, starting with Brian Hook, who currently serves on the board of the Wilson Center and most recently was the senior policy advisor to the Secretary of State and U.S. Special Representative for Iran. Catherine Zimmerman, who's a fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and advisor to AEI's Critical Threats Project. Fatima Abul Asrar, a non-resident fellow at the Middle East Institute. Fatima is from Yemen and served at the Embassy of Yemen here in Washington. And last, but certainly not least, Asher Orkabi, a former Wilson Fellow and research scholar at Princeton University's Trans-Regional Institute. He is author of What Everyone Needs to Know About Yemen. And moderating this discussion is Ambassador Jim Jeffrey, chair of the Middle East Program here at the Wilson Center. But before I turn it over to you, Jim, just a reminder to all our viewers that you can submit your questions to mep@wilsoncenter.org via email or through Twitter to @WilsonCenterMEP. Jim, over to you.
Thank you very much, Marissa. Welcome, everybody. Let me start with two questions, and we'll do two rounds with the first question, then with the second. The first question is, what would an acceptable to the Yemenis and the international community solution be to the conflict we have now? And why haven't we been able to get to such a solution? I'll start with you, Fatima. Please keep your answers to 2 or 3 minutes. Fatima, you're muted.
Thank you. Sorry about that. Thanks, Ambassador. And I'm really glad that you said what's an acceptable solution to the Yemenis. There isn't just one faction of Yemeni people. It's diverse. We're not just looking at the Houthi group. We're not looking at the internationally recognized and backed government of Abdurrabbu Mansour Hadi, but we're also looking at very different factions from the south, from Hudaydah, etc. And the majority of the Yemenis would like to return to what Yemen was like in the transition period after the Arab Spring. So looking at 2011 onwards, where there was a manifestation of trying to build a state and a society together. There was a feeling of inclusion and not the exclusion that we see currently. So ever since the Houthis take over of Yemen in 2014, and ever since the Arab Coalition intervention, the main, we haven't been able to come to an agreement. We haven't been able to stop the military incursions by non-state and non-armed actors. And what is really needed is to push the military violence out of the lives of people on the ground. That is the number one issue that we're facing right now in Yemen. And without that, you have a power imbalance. So, when President Biden took office, he gave a promise of ending the war in Yemen. And of course, a year in, and this is not a promise that he was able to fulfill. And the reason for that is because, I think with the new administration, the thought was you come in, you talk to your allies, you talk to United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia, and you ask them to stop their operations, and then you probably might have peace in Yemen. But what we found out is that while you might have influence on your partners from Saudi and the Gulf, you do not have that on the Houthis and the Iranians. And this is where the imbalance has been. Over the past 2 years, the military operations of the Iran-backed Houthis have intensified in a way that made the humanitarian crisis much worse. And thousands of people have been, have lost their lives in military conflict and battle, and not just humanitarian crisis, but the military conflict that we are not necessarily following very closely, because it seems like whenever we have small or low-level operations from the Houthis, that where thousands of people are killed over a long duration, such as years, in the conflict, we don't necessarily pay attention to that. It doesn't generate headlines on the news as an airstrike would. So over the past few years, there has been a military campaign on the city of Ma'rib, and of course it escalated and went down to southern governorates that have been secure for the past few years from the conflict. And this imbalance in power, and especially in military power, where the Houthis are having the upper hand because of their local, because basically they're sort of uncontested in their military power locally. That presents a huge problem. And of course, you've got the paradox of the Saudi intervention, and that also presents another problem because of the humanitarian catastrophe that has generated. But if we're going to think about an end of the war and end to the peace and starting of the peace process, we really have to think about pressuring all parties together and not just one party. We really have to think about the culpability of the Houthis and Iran in this equation, because so far what we have been doing is focusing on one actor and completely forgetting the other. And I'll stop here and leave others to talk about it further.
Thank you, Fatima, and thank you for keeping to the time. All right, Asha, why don't you tackle the question next?
All right, so I'll piggyback off what Fatima said and actually counter it, because the war in Yemen, the solution is internal and it's a domestic one. But the reason it hasn't come to fruition is because this war was never really about Yemen. All the international powers are not really concerned about what's happening in Sana'a or Sa'ada or Aden or any of the other regions within Yemen, but they're really concerned about the regional implications for the war. On the Saudi side, there's particular concern, and there has been for the past 90 years, on southern border security. There's a disputed border between Saudi Arabia and Yemen, and this has been a source of insecurity for the Saudi kingdom. And so the Saudis, unless they can feel that southern border is secure, are not going to pull their forces and interests out of Yemen. And this has been an ongoing issue for them for the past 90 years. The other issue is the shipment of oil. For about 20 years, the Saudis have been negotiating with various different Yemeni governments for territorial rights to a territorial corridor in Al-Mahra region. That's the easternmost region in Yemen, to construct a pipeline that would allow the Saudis to present an alternative to the contested Strait of Hormuz. So this pipeline is still under construction, and its security would be a very important part for Saudi regional dynamics. And that's also one of the reasons why the Saudis are still sticking it out in Yemen in order to secure the shipment of oil. But the broader question is, that's the Saudis' interest, but why have the Saudis been able to form such a major coalition? And on the one hand, Fatima said it's certainly the presence of Iran, but why is Iran so interested in Yemen and so supportive of the Houthis? And part of this is the misfortune of the Yemeni state collapsing around the same time that the Egyptians announced an expansion of the Suez Canal project. As Abdel Fattah al-Sisi was taking a boat ride, a great celebration down the Suez Canal and its recent expansion, the war in Yemen is breaking out, which means that the Suez Canal is now far more important than it was prior to 2014-15 because it can accommodate far more shipping. Bab el-Mandeb is the southern gate of the Red Sea. It's right along the southwestern coast of Yemen, and it potentially can cause a threat to global shipping and specifically oil shipping through the Red Sea corridor and the Suez Canal. So if you look actually from 2014 through this point, there's been a lot of regional and global investment in economic, military facilities near Bab el-Mandeb in the Horn of Africa, not just by regional powers like Egypt and Turkey and Saudi Arabia, but also by European, US, and Chinese companies and militaries have invested a great deal of money in ports along this very strategic corridor. And we saw what happened in 2020 when the Ever Given container ship blocked Suez Canal for about 2 weeks and the havoc that it caused on global shipping. Imagine what a blockade of the southern gates of the Red Sea could potentially cause for global shipping. So this is something that both regional and global powers are very concerned about, the ramifications of instability in Yemen, potential Houthi government that might emerge and threaten the shipping. And that's particularly why Iran is so interested in cultivating a relationship with the Houthis, is because of this, the Houthi wild card that the Houthis could control and threaten that shipping through Bab el-Mandeb, and therefore give the Iranians, and by extension, their interests, a great deal of leverage and power in the region. And that also explains, lastly, why the Emiratis have remained in this battle, specifically on the islands of Perim and Socotra, 2 islands that are strategically located along this global shipping lane. Is a very important part of the Emirati shipping interests along this area. So with all of these interests in mind, the question was, why is there no resolution? There's no resolution because the war was never really about Yemen. The war was about these larger issues. And these larger issues take a far greater challenge to overcome. And without addressing these larger issues, the Yemenis will continue to fall victim to these broader global regional aims, and it would be far more challenging for them to find that domestic solution that's ultimately needed.
Thank you, Asher. Catherine, over to you.
Thank you, and thank you for having me here today. When we're looking at the war in Yemen and what the international community is looking to get out of it, what their goal is in Yemen today, I think one of the challenges is that there's a general consensus that, of course, the war must end, that there should be a workable partner in Sana'a or some format. And the challenge comes then what that partner looks like. The US has tried to remain somewhat agnostic as to the makeup of a partner in Sana'a, which I actually think is a detriment to American interests, since it's very clear with the Houthi relationship with Iran that, yes, the Houthis will have a say in any future of Yemen going forward. But from the American perspective, having a majority say would be a real challenge for American interests. And then, if you boil down to some of the actors involved, as Asher mentioned, even the Saudis and the Emiratis are on different pages as to which factions they would like to see in power in a government in Yemen. And so when you're looking at this, the challenge of defining who the partner is and what our goals are, the international community is by no means united on what it wants to see come out of the Yemeni war. The other challenge, I think, is that, even as Fatima mentioned, many Yemenis are looking for some post-conflict solution, recognizing that the current war is detrimental to the majority of Yemenis. The elite power brokers are actually in a position to benefit from the current war. And I'd point our audience to the work of Peter Salisbury and other analysts who have really explored how the power brokers inside of Yemen are sitting on top of a phenomenal war economy. And the incentives for these individuals to negotiate some sort of peace deal really isn't there, beyond the leverage that the Houthis, that the US does not really hold over the Houthis and getting them to the table. The actors themselves, even the ones that we're working with, the president of Yemen, for example, the consensus is he's not going to really remain in power once this war transitions. So we're looking at kind of taking the question of what this looks like after war forward. And I think that's a real challenge for the international community. I want to leave it there, and I think there's a lot to explore in these questions. So thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. And over to you to wrap up the first question, Brian.
Thanks, Jim. I think as we're thinking through what does success look like in Yemen, it's very hard to even get to that end state without dramatically reducing Iranian interference in Yemen. And going back to 2014, you had the Iranian regime very smartly for its own sort of geostrategic interests decided to support the Shia tribal militia in the overthrow of the government. And it's similar to what we saw the Iranian regime do in the early 80s in Lebanon when they midwifed the creation of Hezbollah. And they were able to send in a great deal of money, military experts, weapons, and over a period of time, the Lebanese government lost a monopoly on the use of force, and Hezbollah becomes a state within a state. This is a preview of coming attractions in the Gulf. If we don't get serious about addressing Iranian interference in Yemen, I think this has been a critical part of Iran's grand strategy. They've played their hand very well. It has allowed them to be forward deployed. I think Asher earlier talked about, among many interests, the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, which is the gateway to the Red Sea, to the Suez Canal, and to the Mediterranean. About 1/4 of the world's oil supply moves through that strait. Iran has a notorious history of threatening freedom of navigation in the Persian Gulf. By this strategic alliance with the Houthis, it puts them in a position to do the same thing right in the Bab el-Mandeb. And that includes attacking any American vessels that would be working through there as well. So I think if we're going to get to some sort of negotiated end state between the Saudis and the Houthis, I don't think we're going to get there for as long as Iran benefits from endless war. I do think it is the case, very much so, that the Saudis want to end the war, but Iran would like to see endless war. It benefits them enormously. And now they're testing their strength by firing, they've rained rockets and missiles and drones on Saudi for some number of years. And then now we've had lethal attacks in Yemen, courtesy of Iran. On my trips to Saudi, I visited I visited warehouses that were full of Iranian weapons that were interdicted or found on the battlefield. And Iran doesn't have, Iran needs to stay inside of its own borders. And when you look at how the United States, over many decades, has spent a lot of blood and treasure in the Gulf for it to be peaceful and stable, it is important that we do, that we sort of bring to bear all of the different policy levers so that we can minimize. It's very hard to eliminate Iranian interference in Yemen, but we have to do a better job of it.
Thank you, Brian. I'll use my moderator's privilege to make my only editorial comment in this entire panel today, and that is what I'm hearing from all of you with slightly different, but not all that different colorations, is what I call the Vietnam syndrome, which I've seen in Vietnam, in Bosnia, and in other conflicts. And that is a conflict that has basically roots in a focus on the internal situation in country X. And that means no solution without dealing with the realities on the ground in that country and relying on the people to play the biggest role. But on the other hand, an international, often a very important ideological, a power politic, international focus that also must be considered as well. And in all of these conflicts, again, going back to Vietnam, the one we debated the most, even more than Afghanistan, the problem is typically people take one or another side of the coin. This is all an internal conflict, a revolution, George Washington, that kind of thing, or they take the international. This is the domino theory or whatever. And you cannot find a solution without integrating both. That's a necessary, but unfortunately not sufficient condition to find a solution. So now we'll turn back to our panel to ask, what is the specific next step? Not the final solution. You basically touched on that in various ways, but what is the next step that should be taken, either by one or another side in the conflict, one or another outside power, particularly the United States or Saudi Arabia? So we'll start with a slightly different order. We'll start with Catherine.
Wish I had one next step, but I think that, just to touch on the way forward, one, I agree wholeheartedly with Brian that we do need to, as an international community, need to restrain the Iranians, particularly the Iranian arms that are going into Yemen. There's a UN arms embargo that's not being enforced. So a first step would be actually enforcing the arms embargo that's been in place for since 2015. I think a second step from the American side is really recognizing how negotiations work, which is that there's a balance of power that needs to be achieved on the ground. I think one of the challenges the Biden administration met was trying to engage diplomatically when the actors on the ground, particularly the Houthis, were pursuing a military victory. So there's this question of ensuring that there's sufficient military pressure on all sides, that they are going to come to the table and actively negotiate a solution, rather than continue to pursue some sort of military successes. And then I think finally, as we're looking at what to do in Yemen, I would actually want to turn to the humanitarian situation, which is one of the worst in the world and has driven a lot of the policy discussion. I think that we need to have a very realpolitik question and conversation about how humanitarian assistance has been weaponized and politicized inside of Yemen, and how, frankly, I would say the Houthis have managed to manipulate the international conversation such that they can use civilian sites and the requirements for humanitarian emergency assistance in their areas somewhat as a shield to protect and defend their own actions.
Thank you, Catherine. Brian, what's the specific next step that you would take if you were back running much of Middle Eastern policy?
Well, right now, the dynamic that is undeniable is that the Houthis have no incentive to engage in talks. And then the question for policymakers is, how do you change that dynamic so that the costs of not talking are increased? So there's a couple of steps diplomatically. One, stake to delist the Houthis as a foreign terrorist organization. And it was one of the first acts by the Secretary of State in this administration. That has obviously significant substantive effects, but also symbolically, it is signaling to the Houthis that they will have a free hand and they can continue with what they're doing without much consequence. We had spent a great deal of time in the interagency when I was in office examining whether the Houthis met the legal criteria to be designated, and they more than met the legal criteria. And it was a mistake. I understand the motive. It was for humanitarian concerns. But we risk prolonging the humanitarian crisis by not putting in place a realistic strategy to end the conflict. And I think we are perpetuating a status quo that is very dangerous for humanitarian relief. So I would designate them as an FTO. I thought it was also a mistake to lift, the UN arms embargo on Iran expired while we were in office. We triggered the snapback provision under the Iran nuclear deal. That was one of the concessions, that the UN arms embargo on the world's leading state sponsor of terrorism was allowed to expire because of the Iran nuclear deal. We then triggered the snapback of UN sanctions to avoid this arms embargo expiring. And when the Biden administration came into office, they reversed it. And so you had two, I think, significant policy decisions, delisting them as an FTO, and then also allowing the arms embargo to expire, that has allowed Iran to have a free hand in Yemen and even beyond Yemen. So those are two things that one could do. Third thing, I think that talks in Vienna have acquired significance that really prevents other issues from being fully addressed in a way that they might be if we weren't so focused on the Iran talks in Vienna. I think the Iranian regime is exploiting the talks in Vienna. The Biden administration has relaxed the enforcement of sanctions. They haven't put any new sanctions in place. And this is another dynamic that is contributing to the Houthis feeling like there is no pressure for them to engage in significant, meaningful talks that are brokered by the UN Special Envoy. So we need to strengthen the hand of the UN Special Envoy. We've got to put in place a policy on Iran and the Houthis that is going to make it more likely that they come to the table. Right now, there's no incentive for the Houthis to come and talk.
Thank you, Brian. I'll violate my commitment just made a second ago not to make editorial comments with the second one, and that is on the humanitarian argument. In 2018, Mike Pompeo signed away, as he jokingly referred later, his life to authorize USAID and other supported by the US government agencies to operate in areas controlled by Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. Al-Nusra are an offshoot of Al-Qaeda. They were not only on the American terrorism list, but also on the UN list. But we felt it was strategically important to do this, that we weren't going to get them taken off the list, even though their threat at the time was latent. And lo and behold, with that waiver, humanitarian aid in the billions of dollars flowed into northwestern Syria. So there were alternatives for the administration. Okay, now let me pose some questions to get the conversation going. Catherine, Brian suggested lifting the waiver, or lifting of the Houthis from the foreign terrorism list. What do you think of that? And what would be the specific steps and justifications if we were to follow his recommendation?
Yeah, redesignating the Houthis as a foreign terrorist organization is obviously a major policy discussion with regard to Yemen right now, especially after the attacks in the UAE. I think that when we're looking at the justifications the Biden administration used to lift it initially, the humanitarian situation, that hasn't changed at all. I would argue actually that the Houthis themselves have not changed at all for the past year either. We've just seen them actually exercising some of the capabilities that they've had, Iranian sourced, of course. And so the question of why to bring it back now is apt. What I would look for in terms of the redesignation would not just be a signaling, because when we're looking at the effect of sanctions, particularly on the Houthis, just given how their finances and power is structured inside of Yemen, international sanctions will not have a major impact on their day-to-day operations. Particularly if we're not enforcing secondary sanctions as the Vienna talks are ongoing. So there is this juxtaposition with our Iran policy as well. But what I'd be looking for is how they're going to really dynamically change the situation, as Brian mentioned, so the Houthis might come to the table. I think sanctioning for the sake of reacting to the Houthis' recent aggression and having some sort of policy action is not actually a good policy. They need to be part of a strategy that the US really hasn't adapted or adopted for this Yemen crisis. We've had somewhat of a similar strategy and approach over 3 successive administrations, which has been very hands-off and has been really to work through partners. And so, yes, we can mitigate the humanitarian conditions. The Trump administration actually released licenses that met the humanitarian organization's demands and would have alleviated those concerns. Of course, the humanitarian agencies argue that there's a chilling effect on commercial imports to Yemen. I would argue as well that the war itself is a chilling effect because of the uncertainty and the security concerns. And then, to Brian's point, it's a point I've made on the Stockholm Agreement as well. We've made decisions and policy decisions to preserve humanitarian access today that have had long-term ramifications for the power dynamics on the ground. The Stockholm Agreement came out of the conversation over the port of Hodeidah, where there is an imminent Emirati offensive to take it back, which would have deprived the Houthis of control of Yemen's largest port. And also the idea was to take away some of their revenue. The humanitarian concerns again came to play. And I would say, the hindsight in terms of Stockholm was it really handed the initiative back to the Houthis and have drawn this war out when they might have come to the table. It's not certain, but they might have come to the table otherwise. So getting back to the FTO question, I thought it was the way the Trump administration put it on was a little risky in terms of humanitarian situation, didn't have the steps in place to mitigate those concerns. I think the Biden administration could do this in a much more methodical fashion. It has the time to do it now to make sure that when it does come in place, that we actually do have the humanitarian issues covered as we did in Syria. But what I would like to see if we do bring it back is to ensure that we explain exactly why we're doing it and the impact that we're seeking to achieve. Is it to ensure that commercially sourced products from Europe that are going into Houthi weapons are not coming into Yemen? That's something to bring forward. Is it simply to name and shame? And if so, how does that change the dynamics on the ground? So nesting this within a broader strategy will be really critical, I think, if we're going to pay the humanitarian cost of bringing the FTO back.
Thank you, Catherine. Fatima, Catherine's prescription to try to put pressure on the Houthis to bring them to the table. What do you think? Would that fit into the Houthis' ultimate military and political objectives? And is there a way to, if you will, wean them away from Iran and to the peace table in a real way? Over to you.
So far, there hasn't been really any successful strategy that managed to bring, Houthi effectively into negotiation table. What we've had is really, fake negotiations, I would say, or fake diplomacy, where they've signaled some type of intention towards peacemaking, but then they really, fail to follow through. I agree with Brian and Catherine. They have no incentive to come to the negotiating table, and they have stayed very true to their military strategy right from the beginning, which is consolidate power as much as they can throughout this process. And there's nothing that illustrated this more than the Stockholm Agreement, because right after this, the Stockholm Agreement was, it was very clear that it had come to save Hodeidah from an imminent threat, which is, liberate the Arab coalition wanted to take back Hodeidah from the Houthis and cut them off from the Red Sea, control the port of Hodeidah. The argument at that time is that by having a ceasefire on Hodeidah, you prevent a humanitarian crisis, because that's where all of the humanitarian assistance was arriving to. But the counter argument is that if you continue giving Houthis access, to the Red Sea, if you continue giving them access over the population in Hodeidah and elsewhere, and you do nothing militarily to push them back and minimize that power and that access, then you risk continuing the status quo and even making things worse, which is what happened today and what happened, all of these years. And in fact, the immediate consequence was Houthis redeploying all that power that they used for Hodeidah into everywhere else, into Dala and the southern areas, into unfortunately into Ma'rib, into the south, and continuing their large scale operations and consolidating their power more. increasing their power domestically was their first objective. And then the second objective was to increase their threat against, the internationally recognized government of Hadi and its backers, Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates. And they continued doing that. They continued launching drone operations whereby they were testing the powers, testing their drone capabilities, and, kind of worked as an IRGC testing grounds, really, even, claiming attacks on certain, Saudi installations where it seemed to have originated from Iraq and not from Yemen. So there was all of this testing grounds and strategies that Iran was doing in Yemen. And finally, sort of like what Brian was talking about is that a very important goal for the Houthis that directly benefited Iran was to control Bab el-Mandeb, which is a critical maritime choke point in the Gulf of Aden. And the acquisition of the port of Aden would basically, put all of Yemen's ports and waterways, as well as its oil resources, under the Houthis' control. And the situation, of course, Iran would benefit largely from it and would gain leverage against both Saudi Arabia and the United States. So all of this makes the situation really complicated. So far, we've seen the Houthis are gaining or continue to gain the upper hand, and there hasn't been sort of like any type of action that would counterbalance this sort of expansion. And part of it is because this war is you can't fight an asymmetrical warfare with conventional power. So somehow the international community needs to find a more clever way of doing this. And the last point I would say is that diplomacy has failed, talks have failed, and they continue to fail. So there needs to be a reevaluation of both. I mean, military action failed, but also diplomacy has failed. So there needs to be a reevaluation. We need to have, more serious talks and strategy towards this group, rather than just continue the status quo as it is.
As I said earlier, these conflicts are a mix of both internal and external issues. So I'm going to pose a question to Brian and a question to Asher, and Brian, will start with you once I pose the questions. Brian, recently, President Biden spoke with the King of Saudi Arabia, and in this White House readout, you had language essentially criticizing the, quote, Iranian-supported Houthi actions. Now, criticizing Houthi actions has actually been pretty common in the administration, at least over the last 6 months. But this is one of the first times I saw them link that to Iran. So I know how the panelists generally feel about the role of Iran. What I'm not sure of is that I know what the administration feels about the role of Iran in this conflict and perhaps others. So my question to you will be in a second, where is the administration on Iran in this conflict and more generally in the region? Asha will hit you with the internal question. Brian said earlier, using the analogy of Iran mixing it up in Lebanon beginning in the early 80s. The problem is that Israel and Iran didn't get involved in Lebanon until roughly 1982, 1984. But the crisis had torn the place apart with little other than Syria external activity for almost a decade before then. What caused the excuse me, what caused the government to collapse after 2011, and could that have been prevented? Okay, while you're mulling that over, we'll go back to Brian. Brian, over to you.
Well, because I think if we were to identify root causes, if we were to identify root causes, or I would say obstacles toward the end state that I think everybody here agrees on, it is going to have to somehow take an approach to Iran that accomplishes the objective. Iran is the last revolutionary regime on earth. It has a very expansionist foreign policy Yemen, they've been building out their influence in the Shia crescent through Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Palestine, Islamic Jihad, Hamas, the Houthis in Yemen. They've conducted terrorist operations in, I think, 40 countries. They have enormous reach. It has been a central tenet of American foreign policy since the Iranian Revolution to do what we can to limit Iranian influence and power projection. Under the Iran nuclear deal, I think it facilitated Iran's regional ambitions, because the Iran nuclear deal is limited only to the nuclear program. It is silent on its missile proliferation, and it's also silent on Iran's regional ambitions. I think during the Obama administration, from talking to people who were involved, the idea was the Iran nuclear deal would come first, then there would be successive deals that would address Iran's other threats to international peace and security. Those deals never came to pass. It's important, I think, for the Biden administration to learn the lessons from the Obama administration and also from the Trump administration. There was this false choice between the deal or war that was presented by the Obama administration. I think that we proved that that is a false choice. We got out of the deal. We put in place a campaign of pressure on the Iranian regime. Let's see. Hezbollah's funding by Iran has been 70% of their budget. When we were in office, we brought that number down to 20%. And before Al-Qaeda, no terrorist organization has killed more Americans than Hezbollah. So it is very important for us, if we want to get serious about Iran's power projection, to put in place the pressure that makes it harder for them to do that. And you can't do that unless you are serious about Iran's oil program. Everything I see and hear sounds like they're going to lift the oil sanctions on Iran. That's almost 3% of the world's oil supply, and it's $35 billion a year. That money does not go to the Iranian people. It goes to the Houthis. It goes to Hezbollah. It goes to other organizations which destabilize the Middle East. So, Jim, I'm not sure if this is a little bit of an indirect answer to your question. It's a complicated one. I believe that we can have an Iran strategy that is not just one-dimensional. And unfortunately, I think right now we have a one-dimensional Iran policy that is fixated on restoring the Iran nuclear deal. And as a consequence, it is going to create a permissive environment for Iran to accomplish its grand strategy. And they're very, very effective at power projection, more effective than most countries in the region. I don't know how the Iran talks are going to end. They could end in a couple of weeks and we could see a new deal. I'm very worried that we're going to see the Lebanization of Yemen. And that is going to be very much against American interests and the interests of our partners in the region, and have consequences globally. You know, that when the Houthis are attacking UAE and going after airports, and same in Riyadh, it puts everybody in the world traveling to those countries at risk. And the United States has put out a safety warning for travel to UAE. This is a very bad development when we have to do something like that. And we've got to get at the root cause of it with a much smarter Iran strategy that isn't so one-dimensional.
Thank you. Asher, over to you.
So in responding to your question, I'm also going to see if I can challenge an earlier statements made by both Brian and Catherine related to the UN approach towards the internal conflict. And part of that is because the UN, and the reason the UN has failed, beginning already in 2011, is because the UN continues to define Yemen incorrectly. And this began early in 2011, 2012, when Jamal Ben Omar was the UN Special Envoy, pushing Yemen to this national dialogue conference, very ill-fated dialogue conference, which tried to push the government into directions it was not ready to go. And that's because really the UN Special Envoy has been defining Yemen as the same state that was unified in 1990. Right? 1990 comes around North and South Yemen are unified, and it was a rushed unification for a number of reasons. And from 1990 through 2021, 22, there's been a gradual weakening of this Sana'a-based central government and strengthening of northern and southern opposition groups. Right, so certainly what we know most is the Houthi group, which really began as a religious and political revivalist movement and culminated in clashes between the Sana'a-based government from 2004 to 2010. And then eventually the Houthi movement emerges in 2010 as a movement, a populist movement that is an umbrella for a lot of Sana'a opposition to the Sana'a government. So all the northern opposition groups fall under this populist umbrella and form this, transform it from a splinter movement into a much larger political movement. And that's where it takes the Houthi movement today. In terms of the South, since the 1990s, there's been a growing Southern opposition movement, originally known as Al-Hirak al-Junubi, the Southern movement. And today is culminated in the Southern Transitional Council with a lot of money and training from the Emiratis. And this has emerged as probably the organization, other than the Houthis, with the most populist following, especially in the southern and eastern regions of the country. So what you have emerged today, and the kind of situation is today, where a internationally recognized government in exile is really limited to maybe 50 luxury hotel rooms in Riyadh. But that is the main negotiating partner with the UN and with the United States. And focusing on this defunct government as internationally recognized without finally admitting the fact that the 1990 unified country of Yemen has disintegrated. That country is no longer that same unified country, and really it's factions. The country can be divided into 2, 3, or even 4 different groups without acknowledging that fact that the unified Yemen of 1990 is now a factionalized Yemen of 3 or 4 regions. Then you can approach this internal conflict. You have the UN pushing for an old model of what Yemen was, rather than allowing the Yemenis to redefine what the country means in the next stage of negotiations. Right. So the reason the Houthis aren't coming to the table is because it's not. We're still operating under these old 1990 models, where there's a central government and then there's an opposition group, rather than figuring out a way to bring the individual factions and figure out what their goals are. And bring the negotiating table those factions, their goals, and how to solve them.
Thank you, Asha. Let's stick or remain with the internal situation. And Asha challenged some of the prior statements, so let me turn to the other panelists. Comments on Asha's comment, please, over to whoever wants to go first.
Can I just make a quick comment? I do acknowledge everything that Asher said, and I think it's extremely important. And I think that the Riyadh agreement has attempted to fix some of the problems in terms of the disconnect between the northern and the southern faction, and the fact that President Hadi himself, comes from the south is still something that is keeping things together in Yemen. And I think that we might have a real problem if there's, for example, a new transition of power, another president, and especially if they're from northern origin. I think that the fragmentation that Asher talked about is real, and there is no way that we can think about Yemen. It's very difficult for me, to see the future of Yemen as one unified Yemen. I do see it as two, but at the same time, it's extremely difficult for the United Nations to incorporate all of the different factions in the discussion. And in fact, if you go back to the point that you criticized about Jamal bin Omar going to the national dialogue and, facilitating that national dialogue, whereby all the Yemeni factions, including the Houthis, were talking together in 2011 and 2012, but still none felt that they were actually, despite the outcome that was celebrated by everybody, none felt that they were actually represented. Southerners did not feel represented. The Houthis felt that the entire process was just superficial, and they seized the opportunity to gain power. So it was, I think the UN itself cannot, dictate the course of event. And I think that there might be even further conflicts in Yemen to come. And these conflicts, it's not peace that's going to determine the future in Yemen, but further conflict on the ground, whereby, you know, these groups are going to show that they have the power to be their autonomous states, whether Southerners or Houthis or what have you. But what we need from the international community and from the United Nations is some clarity on, you know, maybe even just a little bit of moral clarity on what's right and what's wrong. I mean, and not everything has to be measured by a humanitarian scale. We need a different calculus in this war. The focus on the humanitarian situation, and, you know, having everything, the majority of policies were just dictated because of the humanitarian situation, I think has led to more humanitarian suffering during this war. And, you know, there needs to be a, you know, more of policy decisions with teeth that would actually move, you know, move the balance of power right now and do something against this group, the Houthi group on the ground that has a monopoly of violence. You know, it's so far from what I see right now, the Southerners represented by the Southern Transitional Council, there are some channels of discussion with the you know, Hadi government and with the Saudis, but you don't see that between the Houthis and other factions in Yemen. So how can we get there? How can we facilitate that? It's by pushing the Houthi militarily. And that's extremely important.
We will come back to that. Other comments about the internal situation from our other two panelists?
I will jump in here. I think, you know, when you're looking at what the UN effort is, it's not to resolve the political situation in Yemen, it's to resolve the conflict in order to facilitate intra-Yemeni dialogue to establish what the Yemeni state will look like going forward. So just a correction in the framing there. And when you correct that framing, then you understand, right, the belligerents from the UN side, they're dealing with the Yemeni government. It is the state. The UN is an organization designed to be interstate negotiations. And then also, you know, the Houthis as the de facto authority inside of Sana'a. And there are ongoing track 2 dialogues that the US, the UN, that our Gulf partners are hosting to incorporate some of the Yemeni voices of various factions. And the challenge, which I don't envy Tim Landerking, and I certainly don't envy Hans Grundberg either. They're two very thankless jobs. Trying to understand the complexity of the Yemeni human terrain and the demands, since the Southern Transitional Council, which is a body that was organized after the formation of the war, claims to represent some of the Southerners. It does not represent all the Southerners. There have been protests against the STC in areas where the STC controls and areas outside of it. There are new groups popping up in the South. And I think when you're looking at the factionalization and the fracturing of Yemeni political interests, it gets very complex. So from the international standpoint, it is the regionalization of the Yemeni civil war that has become problematic, the Houthis' ability to project force both to the UAE and I would say threatening the BAM, as you mentioned, and other regional interests, and really restoring a situation where Yemeni factions can go back to the negotiating table. And perhaps we have another maybe better framed national dialogue conference to advance this forward. You know, the failure of the NDC really, which I wrote when it occurred, was that it never solved the core issues at the heart of the 2011 protests and at the heart of the Houthi takeover, which Southerners did participate in and signed off on in September 2014, which is the question of the distribution of resources inside of Yemen, where resources are incredibly few and far between, and the centralization, or I guess the distribution of power. So the question of how a decentralized Yemeni state would look. That was done at the elite level. So going back to some of the concerns that I raised, we are looking at this question of the Yemeni elites negotiating for their own benefit vice that of the Yemeni population. It's incredibly complicated, and it is going to be a Yemeni solution. The challenge, of course, is that various Yemeni factions, the Houthis, the Southerners, the Hadi government, the Islahis, all have various international, mostly regional, external backers, which has thoroughly integrated the local conflict with regional interests.
Thank you very much. Brian, on the external situation, before I went out to Saudi Arabia this summer, I checked in with some administration officials on what is the message that if I wanted to deliver the administration message, I should deliver to the Saudi senior leadership. What they said was, look, the Saudis have lost the conflict. It's like us in Afghanistan. Marib will soon fall, that city that's under siege, and they need to make more concessions. While I'm no expert on Yemen, I said, I think they've made a lot of concessions. Recently, they said they need to make more. I think you've been to Saudi Arabia more recently than I was. How do the Saudis react to that kind of administration position?
Well, sometimes I think it's easier to be tougher on our friends than our enemies sometimes in foreign policy. As I said earlier, there is no question when I was in office and even in my discussion since leaving office, the Saudis would like to end this war. The partner on the other side of the table is no interest in that. And so, as I said, until we change that dynamic, we should expect a continuation of a very miserable status quo. I think, Jim, to your point earlier, I think President Biden in a statement linking the Houthis with Iran is a welcome thing. It happens to be a reflection of reality, but it is a good thing that at least that's being recognized, and I think that was appreciated by the Saudis. Given the strategic interest that we have in Saudi, it's important that we move from treating Saudi like a pariah state, given our strategic interests in the Gulf, and given Saudi's power and influence in the Gulf, it's a foreign policy that will end up backfiring on us. And so maybe the easiest route in these things diplomatically is to ask our friends to do more. But I would caution against a kind of defeatism and fatalism about the current conflict, and maybe take a look at whether U.S. policy decisions have contributed to making this dynamic worse. I liked what Fatima was saying earlier. The military piece has not been successful. The diplomatic piece has not been successful. We do need to have a fresh kind of rethink about this. Regardless of what we come up with, it is, the work of diplomacy is about prioritizing assignments. And for as long as Iran is flowing weapons and military commanders from the IRGC and allowing the Houthis to engage in these deniable attacks with the money and the weapons and the support and the training, we're not going to see a change. Simply not going to happen. What worries me is that we are accumulating risk of a regional conflict if we don't restore deterrence against the Houthis. I think when the Houthis are launching attacks in UAE, as they have been in Saudi, we would be lying to ourselves if we said that our policies are promoting deterrence. There is an enormous in the American people with endless wars in the Middle East. There are different ways to go about it, to avoid wars. And I think there are steps that we take that make it a conflict more likely. I think the steps that have been taken over the last year, we are accumulating risk of a regional conflict. If one of those Houthi drones had hit ADNOC, the UAE state energy facility, if that had hit an airport with Americans or Brits, and you had enormous loss of life, we're looking at an entirely different Middle East, and it's not a good one. And so I think if we want to avoid further conflict, we have to put in place a much tougher, I think Fatima said, a policy with some teeth. Step one is restoring deterrence. Step two is changing the sort of cost-benefit analysis for the Houthis to continuing to not seriously engage in talks and diminishing Iranian influence. If we don't do those things, we're not going to, it's just not going to be possible to reach the other questions that we've been talking about today. You have to prioritize these things in the right way.
Thank you, Brian. We'll now turn to questions from the audience. I will start with my friend, Ambassador Lauren Silverman. What, if anything, can we expect from the Saudi-Iranian discussions regarding the Yemen crisis? Who wants to take that one on? Brian, even though you just spoke, I think the Saudis, at least when I was out there, had a specific set of views on their own negotiations, but I've always used my moderator's privilege. So what do you think the Saudis would say in answer to that?
Well, let me let Catherine jump in since she hasn't spoken in a while. I'd welcome her take on this.
You know, I think what the Saudis are looking out of this is fundamentally for a way to stop the Houthi barrage of attacks on Saudi infrastructure. We hear about it, but I actually don't think that we're aware of the true toll of the Houthi attacks inside of Saudi Arabia, in part because the Saudis, the regime, sought to minimize the press reporting on that early on in the war because it was seen as a sign of weakness. And so, you know, the full telling of what the Houthis have done inside of Saudi Arabia has not really been unveiled. But also, I think in part, because at least in American media, you know, as Brian noted, you know, the Saudis have been framed as a pariah state inside of Yemen, and you know, the fact that they are being attacked in ways that civilian sites are being struck inside of Saudi Arabia, that it's not just acts of war, you know, it's not really been surfaced in our discussion. The interesting dynamic to me is that regardless of what happens between Saudi Arabia and Iran, you know, there are implications and assumptions in terms of that question, in terms of how the US policy is framing that question. There is not peace in Yemen through Saudi-Iranian rapprochement. You know, that needs to be made clear. The Houthis are still an autonomous actor inside of Yemen. Iran has equipped them with the ballistic missiles and UAVs long range that have given them the capabilities, and certainly with the hope and desire that the Houthis would be using them in the way that they have. But at the end of the day, you know, the Houthis perceive themselves not to be subordinated to the Iranian interests, but see themselves as partners and allies of the Iranian state. And that really needs to come forward in any strategy that we pull forward. And second, because, you know, the Iran-Saudi conflict, the Houthi-Saudi conflict, the intra-Yemeni conflict is so entangled now in the regional dimensions, we really do need to pay attention to how a comprehensive discussion inside of the region is going to occur. I agree readily. I can't remember, Ambassador, was you or Brian who said this, but that we are at a position now where regional conflict is much more likely, and I'm afraid it could be sparked by an event from Yemen. And so in terms of what the Saudis are looking to get out of this, I think they're looking to tamp down tensions to avoid that conflict. I think they really see the risk much more clearly than we do here from Washington. But I don't think that they're looking for peace in Yemen by any means. I don't think they believe the Iranians can deliver that.
Thank you. Other comments on the Saudi-Iranian discussions? And for that matter, the United Arab Emirates has its own contacts with Iran, and clearly Yemen must be a subject of some discussion. How do people see these particular routes as a way forward? Asha.
In thinking about, I appreciate turning it over to me, because I think thinking about certainly about the Emiratis and the Saudis and how they see the conflict with Iran over Yemen, it leads back to the question of in responding to Catherine's earlier comment about the UN acting in intrastate conflicts, right? Certainly acting as a mediator between the various different states. And ensuring that it doesn't turn into a regional war. And I think in order to do that, UN needs to play that role, especially in these negotiations, where the UN can act as a peacekeeping organization along that border. There's a precedence, if you look back to the 1960s, an old model for the UN peacekeeping organizations acting along the Saudi-Yemeni border. I think in this case, it would be even more important to ensure that no drones are passing over, missiles passing over. It's much it's easier to monitor that border than it was during the 1960s, far more technology. That would be an important role that the UN would be able to play in order to ensure that events in Yemen don't spill over and turn into a regional conflict. At the same time, internal Yemeni negotiations, as both Catherine and Brian pointed out, shouldn't be run by the UN, but possibly the intervention of the old Doha agreements, the first in two stages of agreements that had been negotiated between the Houthis, the movement in the early 2000s and the Sana'a-based government were deftly negotiated in Doha. That's a precedence that can be built upon rather than going back to Geneva or to Stockholm to negotiate those agreements in freezing cold winter weather. It might be better to go off to Doha or even to Muscat. The Omanis have offered to host that kind of meeting. It might be far more fruitful and allowing then the larger regional conflicts to be negotiated on the UN level.
Thank you very much. We've got two questions on the FSO Safer. That is a rusting oil storage tanker near the port of Moderator that is in danger of exploding and possibly shutting down access to the Red Sea and the Suez Canal. The Houthis are not allowing the UN and others to try to empty the oil from the ship. What are the consequences of that situation on the conflict? What is driving the Houthis, and what can we do about it? Anybody?
Maybe I'll take a jab at this. With the Safer oil tanker, the problem is that, you know, just like any oil tanker, it needs maintenance, and that's the main issue. And it has been rusting. The concern is definitely about an oil leak that could destroy, you know, all types of maritime, you know, fisheries in the Red Sea. So this would have a devastating environmental impact that is, you know, projected to be even worse than the oil spill. You know, in the, was it in the 90s? The I can't remember the name of the ship at the moment, but what I would say is that the Houthis have constantly looked at anything that would strengthen their position. So instead of doing the right thing and allowing access to the UN to inspect and repair the ship, and I think minimal access has been granted, they continue to use this as just a bargaining chip, really, in order to strengthen their position and gain some leverage. It is a card in their pocket at the moment, and they want to use it whenever they feel that they are threatened. And I think up till this very point, they don't still feel that they're threatened enough to actually concede and give access to the ship. So this is something that everyone is aware of, the international community is aware of, but there is really little that they can do if Houthis do not cooperate. And I think there needs, you know, if there's anything that I've learned in the past few years is that Houthis really, you know, although they're aggressive, they care about their international image. And I think that perhaps more attention and more media attention on the negative role that the Houthis are playing in Yemen by, you know, potentially making, you know, by potentially having a hand in this, you know, causing a humanitarian and environmental disaster that will take years to resolve, might be something that could be used to pressure the Houthis to give access. But really, until now, I don't think that they have an incentive to coordinate with the UN body in order to solve this crisis. James, you're on mute.
Right, next question. What is the future of Abdurabu Hadi in the Yemeni political process? Who would like to try that one?
I can address that because I already criticized the government before. So I guess it's easy to criticize the government because they, when Hadi left the country, first escaped Sana'a, went down to Aden, and then went to Riyadh. And Hadi officially invited a Saudi intervention. Right, so that was strike number one against the government, is inviting an outside intervention. It's not the first time that a Yemeni government has asked for Saudi intervention. Saleh asked for Saudi intervention against the Houthis in 2009. Right, so there is precedence for it, and it was certainly in Saudi interest to continue. At the same time, Hadi, when he left Aden, did not think that would be the death knell for his government. And everyone assumed, including the Saudis, that there would be an air campaign against the Houthis. They would pull back, Hadi would return, and this whole thing would be over by Christmas, is the World War I era mantra went. So this was obviously not something that anybody thought would last for as long as it did. So Hadi is stuck without a plan to return. And if you look at each moment that his government tries to return into Aden, there's either a major attack on the airport, or there's half the army is there to protect Hadi and several of his ministers. So it's a very difficult and tenuous situation. There's not a great deal of popular support, as Catherine pointed out, that there's fractured support in the South in particular. So Hadi's political future is very much dependent upon this label of internationally recognized government. As long as the UN and other agencies keep talking to him, he has a job. But as soon as they stop talking to him, then it's not clear what role Hadi and his ministers can continue to play in Yemen.
Thank you. Next question. What is the state of Yemen civil society? Are there local groups still operating in the country on issues such as humanitarian assistance and political pressure? Who wants to take that one? Fatima.
Yeah, sure. The civil society in Yemen is still alive and well. There are groups operating in the north and the south, in Houthi-controlled area and southern-controlled areas, in government-controlled areas. So they're all alive and well with certain restrictions and limitations. Of course, in Houthi-controlled area, it's naturally, there are so many limitations, and the Houthis are getting involved and dictating what civil society should be doing. It's really becoming a police state in Houthi-controlled areas. And I think really without civil society and without the solidarity that people have had internally, Yemen couldn't have survived all of these years of war. So, you know, certainly there is, I mean, certainly they're there. They still receive assistance, and I do work with a number of organizations and especially on the human rights front, as there's been increasing violations on human rights, and the community in Yemen is really trying hard to document and play an active role in really supporting just a healthy society, you know, after all of this devastation from the war. So I think that's what I can say about that.
Can I follow up with Fatima, because I just recently did some work on civil society organizations in Yemen. So Yemen has a long history of localized development, both humanitarian aid development and long-term development. So Yemen continues to be a place with a very active civil society scene, including the Social Fund for Development, which is a parallel government organization. And in a recent meeting with some of the heads of the Social Fund for Development in Yemen, that's still working very closely with the World Bank on a lot of humanitarian and long-term development issues. There still is a great degree of freedom of operation in Yemen, surprisingly, where the Houthis haven't yet clamped down on the Social Fund for Development. The SFDs continue to operate, and they operate across provinces. So there's a lot of potential for future localization of aid, rather than the World Food Program, for example, come and dump food on Yemen. There's options, a lot of smaller organizations, local organizations of Yemen that can locally source that food and can be far more sustainable. So to Fatima's earlier point, I think that yes, there is still a very active scene, and I think one that, if properly funded and properly supported, could be a long-term solution for Yemeni society outside of the political arena.
Thank you. Brian, this question for you. The administration has continued providing defensive arms to our allies in the region, particularly surface-to-air systems, and especially to Saudi Arabia, arguing that it's for their defense. The Saudis have said that they are being denied precision strike munitions, which would allow them to, with less collateral damage, essentially defend themselves by striking at the factories that manufacture drones and missiles, and basically hold at risk high-value Houthi targets and thus deter them from attacking Saudi Arabia. You've dealt with this when you were in the administration. Is there any way to parse this between offensive and defensive weapons?
In this political environment, it's very hard to do that, but I think it's certainly worth the effort. I saw that General McKenzie at CENTCOM provided fighter jets to UAE. We have put the USS Cole into a more strategic position. And the missile defense systems, whether in Saudi and UAE, we have tried to enhance those. The problem is these drones. And our missile defense systems don't have the same sort of deterrent that they have against missiles as they do against drones. This is very, very difficult. And it's very porous in terms of the ability of drones to reach their intended targets. So even if we put in place the kind of systems that will defend against missile attacks, it does not solve the problem completely. I think it's good that the Biden administration is doing more to help, I guess, defend, but it's still not a comprehensive strategy. It's part of a strategy. It's a tactic, but that tactic needs to be harnessed into a broader strategy that is actually going to accomplish our national security objectives. As we talked about earlier, I think there are sufficient American national security objectives and those of our partners in the region so that we can avoid a regional conflict. And if we have the Houthis on Saudi's southern border freely able to attack UAE, Saudi, Israel, etc., using drones and missiles and other capabilities, it's a very dangerous circumstance. So I would be in favor. I very much like the approach we took, in defeating ISIS by, with, and through allies. Jim, that was your portfolio. Maybe you could give some comments on the by, with, and through strategy in a place like Yemen. But I think for the Saudis, burden sharing was a big part of what we put in place in the Trump administration. And if you read President Trump's Riyadh speech that he gave in May of 2017 before 55 Arab Muslim nations, I really think that it was the playbook that we executed against for 4 years. It was successful. We had a very successful, I think, strategy to the Middle East broadly. We had, I think, periods of being overextended in the Middle East, and we've had periods of retrenchment. And I think we found the balance. I think the pendulum, has swung from one side to the other in terms of an adventurous foreign policy, and then perhaps maybe a little more isolationist foreign policy. The problem in the Middle East, and Jim, you and I have talked about this, you can leave the Middle East, but it tends to follow you. And so I like the idea of helping countries like UAE, Saudi, Bahrain, Israel, those countries that are on the front lines of Iranian aggression, giving them the tools that they need to defend themselves and to promote peace. And you're not gonna have peace, especially with the Iranian regime, unless you have deterrence. We know from 42 years of experience with this regime that timidity invites aggression. It's just how this regime operates. And if dialogue and engagement worked, we would have solved this problem a long time ago. You always keep the door open, obviously, for dialogue and have an off-ramp for diplomacy. But I think right now, there isn't any credible threat of military deterrence. And as a consequence, I think we're losing it in the Middle East. I'd like to see us recapture it. And I think it's certainly doable. And as I mentioned earlier, President's speech in Riyadh, burden sharing is a big part of it. We ought to be helping our partners in the region to defend themselves. I'm open to a number of different outcomes. I leave that to the defense experts, but I think that we ought to do more than what we're doing.
Thanks. A note on by, with, and through. And that had several elements that probably are not totally relevant to Yemen in detail, but it's food for thought. First of all, there was after some flopping around in 2014-15, there was a very clear Obama and then Trump administration policy, the utter destruction of the Islamic State. Secondly, to do this by, with, and through partners. And thirdly, a ruthless prioritization of military success over and above everything else other than American casualties. That got us in trouble at various points with the Peshmerga Kurds in the north of Iraq. It got us in trouble with the Iranians and obviously the Turks. Nonetheless, we managed to sort all these things out and destroy the Islamic State. How relevant that is in detail to Yemen, I'm not sure, but the idea of having a clear, goal with international buy-in, and we had 80 nations supporting us, to have a policy that avoids the endless war, which is mainly endless American casualties syndrome, and thirdly, works with our partners, and finally, recognizes, and I'm still not sure this administration gets it, recognizes the importance of military force, not as the only, not maybe as the most important, but as a major criterion for foreign affairs in the 21st century. Okay, one last question. Is there any difference in the quality of life, if I can use that word for Yemen, the humanitarian situation in those three areas controlled by the government, in the south and in Houthi areas? Who wants to tackle that?
Maybe I could shed some light on the quality of life in Yemen. I've lived in Yemen for a while. We still maintain relationships with people who are living in all of these different areas. And I can tell you that the situation in Sana'a is extremely bleak. And it is because of the violations that people feel on the very, including the family level. Sana'a under the Houthis have transformed to be a police state. There has been elements of control over people's thoughts, actions, and monitoring of everything, including permission to, Houthis feel free to even take your cell phones and look into the contents of it, and can put people in jail based on political thought. So the freedoms are political freedoms are extremely restricted. Freedom of thought and expression is no longer there. And there is just this, sense of fear. People are being arbitrarily arrested as well, whether they have a political affiliation or not. And we've worked with several groups that have been subjected to torture for very small offenses. So this has been really troubling. And I think one of the things that is probably, bringing more rising dissent against the Houthis and Houthi-controlled areas is that as the Houthis have run out of fighters, they're increasingly using child soldiers, and it has moved from non-voluntary recruitment into, forcible recruitment for the children. So and forcible recruitment of also civil servants into the militias, and that has been very problematic. The situation also is very turbulent in government-controlled areas as well, because there are different factions, and then there's always political unrest, and of course, definitely, certain restrictions of freedoms that come because of the war. So in government-controlled areas, I think, both the lack of feeling of security, and the constant fighting and unrest is one of the just one of the things that affect the quality of life. But at the same time, both in Ma'rib before the current war and in places like Aden or Hadramaut, people still feel that there is a sense of, it still represents a safe haven for a lot of Yemenis, and especially the Yemenis in the north who are trying to escape Houthis' brutality. One important thing that I want to mention about religious freedom is that minorities like the Baha'is are being targeted, and that, and although they're really small in numbers, they're being isolated, and have been subjected to just death sentences and other forms of intimidation by the Houthi militia. And if the international community hasn't stepped up and issued strong statements against the Houthi, the future of these minority could have been completely threatened and wiped out. And they still find some safe haven in government-controlled areas. So yeah, that's probably what I can say about living in Yemen today.
Thank you very much, Fatima. Now, 1 minute final comments by each of you. We'll go in reverse order from the beginning, if I can remember the beginning. So Brian, I think we start with you.
My final thoughts are Tim Lenderking has a very hard job. And I think that whether it's Tim, I think Tim is to some extent, as the U.S. envoy for Yemen, is to some degree at the mercy of the talks in Vienna. And so it would be, I think, useful if we're going to have an Iran deal, it'd be good to get that done quickly, because it does seem to have had a chilling effect on other instruments of American power that could be used, I think, effectively in a place like Yemen, so that we can have a Gulf that is much more stable and much more at peace than it currently is with the Houthi threat. So I would be in favor of prioritizing things in a way that gets at the root cause. And Iran is trying to lay very deep roots in Yemen. And it's important, I think, for us to be, to ask, I think right now the debate is mostly around humanitarian questions. But I think the question is, we have a reality where Iran conducts warfare through indigenous third parties in multiple theaters in the region. Yemen is one of those theaters. How do we lessen Iran's ability to project power? If we don't do that, everything else is going to be academic. It's not going to be possible to make any kind of progress given the outsized role that the Iranian regime plays in supporting the Houthis across so many different vectors.
Thank you. Catherine?
Just briefly, I think when we're looking at the situation in Yemen, it's very clear that the US approach and the international approach since the start of the war through today across multiple administrations has been ineffective. And so I would be looking really for a true rethink of what we are going to try to do in Yemen. And from the American perspective, that's clearly identifying our interests and then setting achievable objectives and moving forward, rather than what I would say are tactical shifts in policy and almost reactive shifts in policy to developments, which in many cases I feel have actually worsened the situation in Yemen or not actually advanced American interests, making it much harder for us to say that we are happy with the situation, and for the Yemeni conflict, it's much more intractable today. So I think that we need to start again from zero, reassess and move forward rather than starting with the framework that we currently have, because it's clearly flawed.
Thank you very much. Asher?
So I just want to end also thanking the Wilson Center and Ambassador Jeffrey for having this kind of panel, because Yemen is very dear to my heart. I still have family and friends who are there. I still very much am a Yemeni nationalist. And I still hold out an optimistic hope for a resolution in Yemen. And that resolution is echoed by the panelists here, is one that both has a regional and global dynamic, but also has a local dynamic. That Yemen needs to be solved both as a local domestic problem, but also one that has regional implications. And as reiterated a number of times, these are different, but are not mutually exclusive. And they're two that need to be solved simultaneously. One cannot be solved without the other. And I'm optimistic for a future where Yemen or multiple Yemeni regions or states come to a fine, peaceful resolution. We can all go back and have this meeting not virtually based out of DC, but in Sana'a or Aden. So thank you again for hosting this, the Wilson Center.
Thank you. And last but not least, Fatima.
Thank you, Ambassador. I would say I'm fairly optimistic as well. I think the Biden administration has taken a number of steps that have somewhat been reassuring for many of the Yemeni people who see the United States as a partner in this struggle. By appointing Tim Linderking, by having specific terrorism designation of specific Houthi members, by taking all of these right steps to have more of a close-up look into Yemen, as opposed to having another UN mediating in the conflict, that the Biden administration had gained firsthand knowledge of the obstacles that are happening, and therefore can maybe reevaluate and reassess its position right now, where we can move from grand statements of ending the war on Yemen and really work on the obstacles that are being introduced due to the various complexities in this conflict. So I'm really hopeful that all of these discussions with US partners in the region, with the Yemeni people, that would sort of bring a more evaluation of Yemen's conflict and take us a little bit away from looking at the problem to actually finding a solution to this problem.
Final remarks. First of all, a set of thanks. First and foremost, to our viewers today. The Wilson Center operates on the principle, not only of bipartisanship, but that an informed public in a democracy can have a real role in foreign policy. We're all holding our breaths today over Ukraine, but those of you who've been around a while know that the Middle East, be it in 1979, 1983, 1991, 2001, 2003, and in the broader Middle East just this summer in Afghanistan, can just as much dominate our worries and concerns and attention. The goal of forums like this is to educate folks, to have an effect on policy, and to ensure that not too long from now, we're not facing another roaring international crisis of the magnitude of these others with Yemen. Next, I would like to thank, of course, the panelists for participating and bringing your views to the table. Also, Tracy Fitzgerald and our wonderful IT team at the Wilson Center, and finally, my colleagues in the Middle East program, Marissa, Brooke, and Alex. Thanks as always for your support, and for everybody, hope to see you soon. Bye-bye.